November 9th, 1923. 8:30 p.m., Munich, Germany. The smell of beer and gunpowder mixed in the air, broken tables, shattered glass, echoing shouts, and a single man trembling with conviction. Adolf Hitler. An unknown name then, a failed artist turned soldier. A man who once begged on the streets of Vienna now demanded destiny itself to listen. He raised his hand as if commanding an invisible army. Behind him, swastikas drawn in charcoal and sweat. Before him, a crowd drunk not just on beer, but on pain. Pain of losing the Great War. Pain of watching a proud empire crumble into humiliation. Pain that would soon be moulded into anger. The attempted coup that night, the beer hall putsch, failed. But something far more dangerous survived. An idea. That democracy was weak. That violence could rebuild pride. That fear could be power. The calendar rolls backward. June 28, 1919. The Palace of Versailles glows in the summer sun. Inside, men in tailored suits sign the peace that was meant to end all wars. But for Germany, it was no peace at all. It was punishment. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. It branded an entire nation as guilty. 132 billion gold marks in reparations. Territories lost, army crippled, dignity erased. Outside the palace, a German delegate whispered, "This is not peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. He was almost right. It took exactly 20 years and 72 days for the world to be engulfed again. Europe in the 1920s was not a continent reborn. It was a continent bleeding quietly, factories silent, families hungry, borders redrawn with shaky hands, empires, Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, all vanished into ghosts. And in their place, confusion, nationalism, fear. The Weimar Republic in Germany tried to stand tall on trembling legs, democracy, freedom, elections. But freedom cannot feed an empty stomach. By 1923, hyperinflation had reduced life to absurdity. Children played with stacks of worthless banknotes. A loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Men carried wages in wheelbarrows, only to find prices doubled by the time they reached home. And amid this chaos, one voice began to rise. Angry, theatrical, magnetic. A man who promised order, who said, "Germany will rise again." He didn't need to be right. He only needed to be loud. Fascism does not begin with power. It begins with fear. Fear that someone else is to blame. Fear that democracy is too weak. Fear that the world has forgotten you. In the alleys of Rome, in the streets of Munich, in the heart of every humiliated soldier, that fear grew like a disease. And soon it found its prophets, Mussolini, Hitler, Franco. October 1922. Rome, Italy. Fog rolled through the cobblestone streets like a living thing. Somewhere beyond it, footsteps, synchronized, deliberate, endless. 10,000 men marching toward the capital, each one dressed in black, each one believing they were saving their country. They called it the March on Rome. And at its head walked a man with a square jaw and an iron stare. Benito Mussolini, former schoolteacher, failed journalist, now self-proclaimed savior of Italy. At dawn, the air in the capital thickened with tension. King Victor Emmanuel III hesitated in his palace, uncertain if the army would obey him or the mob. Trains were seized, post offices taken. Fascist militias patrolled the streets with stolen rifles. And then the unbelievable happened. The king refused to sign a decree for martial law. Instead, he invited Mussolini to form a government. A dictator was not born in battle. He was invited in. That was how fascism began, not with force but with fear. The fear of instability, the fear of communism, the fear of losing control. Mussolini called his movement Fascismo, from fasces, the ancient Roman symbol of power, a bundle of sticks bound around an axe. Unity through strength, obedience through violence, order through fear, Under his regime, Italy transformed almost overnight. Political parties dissolved, trade unions banned, newspapers silenced, children taught to salute, women told their duty was to bear soldiers, men told their destiny was to die for Rome, and behind the parades, the flags, the cheers, there was always the sound of boots, rhythmic, unquestioning, the sound of democracy, suffocating. Italy under Mussolini became the blueprint of authoritarian seduction. He did not seize power in one night. He sculpted it, bit by bit. He used propaganda like an artist uses light, to hide the cracks and exaggerate the glory. Cinema, posters, speeches, all repeating one message: believe, obey, fight. To the unemployed, he promised jobs, to the veterans honor, to the rich stability, to the poor dignity, to everyone an enemy, the communists, the liberals, the foreigners. Fascism didn't just offer control, it offered meaning. The world after the Great War was too complicated. Economies crashed, empires vanished. Democracy demanded patience, but Mussolini offered something simpler: blind faith, clear enemies, a glorious destiny. It's easy to forget that the first people who cheered for fascism didn't think they were surrendering freedom. They thought they were reclaiming it. And that is the most dangerous illusion of all. While Italy marched under black flags, another country watched and learned. A broken nation to the north, a nation starving for identity, pride, and revenge. Its people listened to speeches filled with rage and redemption. And in the beer halls of Munich, one man took notes: the failed putschist, the prisoner of Landsberg, the future Führer, Landsberg prison, Bavaria, April 1924. Cold air seeped through iron bars, carrying the smell of damp stone and old sweat. A guard's boots echoed down the corridor, pausing before cell 7. Inside sat a man hunched over a wooden table, his pencil trembling with obsession. Adolf Hitler, inmate No. 45. He wasn't alone. Across from him, Rudolf Hess took dictation, recording every furious word. The cell became a pulpit, the paper a weapon, and the ideas taking shape were not confessions. They were blueprints. Outside, Germany tried to forget him, the failed coup leader, the lunatic nationalist, the man whose revolution collapsed in minutes. But prison gave Hitler something more dangerous than freedom: time. He reread history not to understand it, but to rewrite it. He blamed the weak politicians of the Weimar Republic. He blamed the Jews, the communists, the bankers, and in that hatred he found purpose. He called it Mein Kampf, my struggle. Page by page it became both manifesto and prophecy, the anatomy of a coming nightmare. The book was madness, clothed in method. Hitler laid out his vision of racial hierarchy, living space, and national rebirth. He declared that democracy was a lie, that peace was weakness, that war was the natural state of man. To millions it would one day sound like destiny. To historians it reads like a warning that no one believed. When he left prison after just 9 months, the world barely noticed. The press mocked his fanaticism. Politicians dismissed him as a clown, but he had learned something crucial. Power was not seized through violence, it was seduced through legitimacy. By 1929, the Great Depression tore through the world like an invisible plague. In the United States, stock markets crashed. In Germany, they imploded. Factories closed overnight. Unemployment soared past 6 million. Bread lines grew longer than church queues. Desperation filled every conversation. And when people lose their livelihood, they stop searching for truth. They search for someone to blame. The Nazis offered an answer. Not you, them. Every slogan, every rally, every march, crafted to turn frustration into fury. They didn't just promise jobs, they promised vengeance. Fascism feeds not on ideology but emotion. It takes chaos and offers certainty. It takes shame and calls it pride. It takes grief and sells it as rebirth. By 1932, the National Socialist Party had become the largest in Germany. Its rallies were not politics, they were theatre. Spotlights cut through night skies, drums thundered, flags rippled like waves of flame. Each event choreographed to erase doubt and replace it with belonging. January 30th, 1933, Berlin. Chancellery Building. Rain lashed against the windows as President Paul von Hindenburg signed a single sheet of paper. Adolf Hitler, Chancellor of Germany. No gunfire, no coup, no invasion, just ink. That is how democracies die, quietly, legally, with applause. Outside, torches flared across the Tiergarten. Thousands marched beneath red banners, shouting the same word again and again. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. The sound rolled through Berlin like thunder, and somewhere deep within that storm, the world began to shake. Across the continent, leaders watched the spectacle with disbelief. To some, Hitler was a fanatic who'd burn out in months. To others, a useful bulwark against communism. No one saw the abyss beneath his promises, yet one man did. In London, Winston Churchill warned, "The menace of Nazism is rising like a tide of poison gas. It will not stop at Germany's frontiers." Few listened. Berlin, 1933. A new Germany was being born, not in light, but in the careful choreography of shadows. Flags with black swastikas rose over city halls. Children sang songs that praised the Führer. And every morning, millions of Germans woke up believing they were witnessing a national miracle. Factories reopened. Unemployment fell. Bread returned to the tables. For a people who had lived through humiliation, inflation, and despair, it felt like redemption. But it wasn't redemption. It was conditioning. February 27th, 1933. Flames lit up the night sky above the Reichstag, Germany's parliament building. Within hours, the Nazi Party blamed the communists. The next day, Hitler convinced President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree, suspending civil liberties for the protection of the people. That single act turned the Weimar Constitution into a corpse. No court, no newspaper, no voice could now oppose him. Tens of thousands were arrested overnight. Political rivals disappeared, not into prisons, but into places no one yet had a name for. The illusion of order had begun. Weeks later came the Enabling Act, March 23rd, 1933. The Kroll Opera House, surrounded by brown-shirted SS and SA men, the Reichstag convened one last time. Hitler stood before them, promising unity and renewal. The deputies of Germany voted to give him absolute power. Only the Social Democrats opposed. As they rose to vote no, Nazi stormtroopers hissed threats from the galleries. When the ballots were counted, democracy had legally committed suicide. Outside, Hitler emerged to a roaring crowd. His voice trembled with triumph. The people and the Führer are one. That was the night Germany ceased to belong to its citizens. It now belonged to his vision and his paranoia. The Nazi regime didn't conquer minds by force alone. It built a machine, precise, beautiful, terrifying. 1. The Propaganda Ministry. Headed by Joseph Goebbels, a master manipulator who understood that emotion is stronger than truth, he transformed radio into religion. Every German home had to own one, the Volksempfänger, people's receiver. Every broadcast carried the same rhythm, the same cadence, the same worship. Even music was censored. Jazz, band, dissent, erased. Cinema became sermon. Leni Riefenstahl's triumph of the will turned rallies into divine spectacle. Camera angles made Hitler seem superhuman. Aerial shots turned crowds into waves of faith. 2. The Gestapo, formed under Hermann Göring, the secret police replaced courts with fear. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Whispers became crimes. Anonymity became extinction. 3. The Hitler Youth. To secure the future, they captured the children. Schools replaced textbooks with ideology. History rewritten, biology weaponized. Every boy was told his destiny was to fight, every girl to bear soldiers. By the age of 10, they could march, salute, and chant slogans with perfect precision, the rhythm of obedience. The brilliance of fascism was not that it crushed opposition, it converted it. Ordinary citizens began to police themselves. Fear became habit, loyalty became survival. To most Germans, life felt stable. Trains ran on time. Crime vanished. Flags fluttered with pride. It was a nation hypnotized by its own reflection. In truth, the Nazi regime was less a government than a stage performance, a ceaseless act of theatre where belief replaced reality. The people no longer asked whether something was right, they only asked whether it was German. June 30th, 1934. A storm swept across Germany, but not from the sky. In the darkness, SS units fanned out under secret orders. Hitler, now paranoid about rivals within his own movement, unleashed Operation Hummingbird, later known as the Night of the Long Knives. One by one, those who had helped him rise, Ernst Röhm, Gregor Strasser, hundreds of others, were hunted and executed. No trial, no questions, no remorse. When dawn broke, Hitler announced he had purged traitors. The army swore allegiance to him personally. For the first time in German history, loyalty was no longer to the state. It was to a man. And that man had become the law. Europe saw the headlines but not the pattern. Britain called him a bulwark against communism. France worried more about its own politics. America watched from across the ocean, distant and indifferent. The League of Nations, built to prevent another war, issued statements, and nothing else. The silence of the world became Hitler's greatest ally. By 1935, the transformation was complete. Germany no longer spoke in many voices. It spoke in one. It marched in one direction. It dreamed one dream of empire. The swastika flew over every school, courthouse, and factory. Jews were stripped of citizenship through the Nuremberg laws. Books burned in public squares. Church bells rang not for God, but for the Führer's birthdays and victories. And deep beneath that illusion of unity, something monstrous stirred. The idea that peace was weakness and conquest was destiny. The road to war had begun to pave itself. Manchuria, 1931. A steel-grey dawn broke over the Chinese hills. The silence was shattered by the thunder of locomotives and rifle fire. The Japanese Imperial Army had engineered an explosion on its own railway line, a staged incident that would justify the invasion of an entire province. Tokyo called it the Manchurian Incident. The world called it a violation of peace. Japan called it destiny. While Europe was still licking its wounds, the East was already bleeding. Japan in the 1930s was a nation with factories but no fuel, islands but no resources. Coal, oil, iron, all imported, population soaring, military pride boiling. To its generals, expansion was not greed, it was survival. They spoke of Asia as their destiny, a co-prosperity sphere under the rising sun. And so, in Manchuria, Japan built its first puppet state, Manchukuo, crowned with a pretend emperor and real chains. When the League of Nations condemned the act, Japan simply walked out. The message was clear. International law was optional. October 1935. Abyssinia, Ethiopia. Italian bombers roared across the African sky. Villages burned beneath mustard gas and machine gun fire. It was an empire born in poison. Mussolini called it revenge, a return to Roman glory. He promised his people an African colony to wash away Italy's humiliation in World War I. But what he really proved was this: fascism thrives when the world looks away. The League of Nations protested again. Resolutions, speeches, and no action. Sanctions were half-hearted, and oil still flowed to Rome. The message echoed again. Aggression without punishment invites repeat performance. By 1936, 3 leaders shared a vision, carved in iron. Hitler, who wanted Europe. Mussolini, who wanted an empire. Hirohito's generals, who wanted Asia. They saw in each other a mirror of ambition. And in October 1936, Berlin and Rome signed the Axis Pact, a line drawn through the world, splitting it between those who would dominate and those who would submit. Months later, Japan joined with the Anti-Comintern Pact, aimed at crushing communism, but really preparing for a global alignment of dictatorships. The 1930s were a decade of meetings, not actions. Every time the dictators tested the world, they found it silent. When Japan invaded Manchuria, no war. When Italy gassed Ethiopia, no consequence. When Germany rearmed the Rhineland in 1936, not a shot was fired. Fascism didn't march into power alone. It was invited by the timidity of those who believed that appeasement was peace. March 7th, 1936. German troops crossed the Rhine. The Treaty of Versailles forbade it. The Locarno Pact prohibited it. But Hitler did it anyway. Behind the columns of marching soldiers, the truth, they had orders to retreat if France fired even a single bullet. France did not. Britain did not. The world watched and calculated, but Hitler watched and learned. He learned that fear was stronger than treaties, and hesitation was permission. From that moment, he knew the road to empire was open. 1936 was also the year of spectacle. At the Berlin Olympics, Germany wore a mask of peace, flags, music, and precision, a festival of order that hid a nation of fear. Foreign journalists marveled at its efficiency, its discipline, its rebirth. But beneath the applause, the machine of death was already warming its engines. Concentration camps expanded, censorship deepened, militarization accelerated. Across the world, a pattern formed, fascism as pageantry, violence as ritual. July 17th, 1936. Spain. Gunfire in the streets of Seville. The Spanish Civil War had begun, a dress rehearsal for World War II. Mussolini and Hitler sent planes, tanks, and soldiers to support General Franco's fascists. They tested weapons and tactics that would soon be unleashed on the world. Among them was the Luftwaffe, which in 1937 reduced the Basque town of Guernica to rubble, the first civilian bombing in modern history. Pablo Picasso would paint its horror in monochrome, a world screaming in silence. But the silence of nations was louder. Vienna, March 12th, 1938. The morning air trembled before the sound arrived, a deep, rolling thunder that came not from the sky but from engines and boots. German tanks crossed the border without resistance. Children waved flowers, old men wept. Austria had not been conquered. It had surrendered to hope. The Anschluss, the union of Germany and Austria, had been forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. But now the treaty existed only on paper, and paper burns easily. When Hitler entered Vienna the next day, he was showered with roses. Crowds stretched for miles. They shouted not out of fear, but ecstasy, as though history itself had forgiven them. The city that once mocked him as a failed painter now bowed to him as a messiah. "I have returned home to my people," he declared, and the cheers swallowed the words whole. For millions of Germans and Austrians, this was not invasion. It was reunion. National pride had become narcotic. In those cheers lay the echo of every nation that mistakes unity for obedience. Europe watched again, and again did nothing. Britain rationalized. The Germans and Austrians are one people. France hesitated, trapped in political paralysis. The League of Nations was silent, its chamber echoing with ghosts of failed speeches. In Berlin, Goebbels ordered newsreels to show jubilant faces and waving flags. No cameras were allowed inside the prisons, where Austrian dissenters were already being re-educated. Propaganda turned occupation into celebration, and the world applauded the performance. With Austria secured, Hitler's eyes turned next to Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, home to ethnic Germans. He claimed they were persecuted, repeating the same lie that justified every conquest. In September 1938, At the Munich conference, the leaders of Britain and France, Neville Chamberlain and Edouard Daladier, met with Hitler. No Czech representative was invited. Chamberlain returned to London waving a piece of paper. "Peace for our time." Crowds cheered him as if words could halt tanks. Within 6 months, Hitler occupied all of Czechoslovakia. Peace for our time had lasted 168 days. Appeasement was not cowardice alone. It was exhaustion. The generation that had buried sons in 1918 would do anything to avoid another war. But peace built on. Denial is not peace. It is postponed tragedy. The world misunderstood Hitler's genius. He did not win through war. He won through fear of it. Every time his enemies hesitated, he redrew the map. Every time they spoke of peace, he prepared for invasion. Diplomacy was his camouflage, time his weapon. November 9th, 1938, 15 years after the failed beer hall putsch, Germany burned again, this time its own cities. Synagogues set ablaze, Jewish homes smashed, shop windows shattered in 1,000 shards of reflected fire. Hence the name Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. The attack wasn't spontaneous. It was orchestrated. SS officers handed civilians hammers and gasoline. The police were ordered to look away. When dawn came, over 90 Jews were dead, 30,000 sent to camps, and entire neighborhoods reduced to ash. The message was unmistakable. Germany was cleansing itself, and the world still refused to see the smoke. Embassies issued protests. No one issued ultimatums. Nations recalled ambassadors, but not consciences. Refugees fled in the tens of thousands, but borders closed in their faces. In the quiet that followed, Hitler tested a new boundary, morality itself, and found it empty. He understood now that he could do anything, and so plans accelerated, not only for conquest, but for eradication. March 1939. German troops entered Prague. It was no longer about Germans uniting Germans. It was about Germans ruling everyone. Britain and France, humiliated, finally drew a line. They guaranteed Poland's independence. But Hitler smiled. Lines are made to be crossed. In August 1939, he secured the final piece of his strategy, a pact with the unlikeliest partner, the Soviet Union. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact carved Eastern Europe like a corpse. Half for Stalin, half for Hitler. Between them, Poland waited, alone. September 1st, 1939, 04:45 a.m., Westerplatte, Poland. The sea was calm, the air cold enough to bite. Then, from the mist, the battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire. Shells screamed across the harbour, tearing through the Polish garrison. In that instant, the world's uneasy peace shattered. The Second Great War had begun. Columns of panzers rolled across the border like liquid metal. Dive bombers, the Stukas, plunged from the clouds, sirens wailing like banshees. Their shriek became the soundtrack of terror. Behind them came motorized infantry, precise and pitiless. This was blitzkrieg, lightning war, speed, surprise, and coordination. No static trenches, no waiting, only momentum. Within 3 weeks, Poland was split in two. Warsaw, a city of 1.3 million, became rubble and smoke. From the east, Soviet forces invaded as agreed in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Poland was consumed before the world finished debating what to call it. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. Words without motion. Their armies stood behind the Maginot Line, waiting for a battle that never came. In the newspapers, it was called the phony war. For the people of Poland, it was anything but phony. Refugees clogged the roads west. Children walked barefoot through frost. The Luftwaffe strafed columns of civilians. The radio played only static and propaganda. The world listened and did nothing. April 1940. Snow melted in Norway and Denmark. At dawn, German warships appeared in their harbours. In a single day, both nations fell. Hitler's armies moved like weather, swift, inevitable, unstoppable. Then came France, May 10th, 1940. The panzers struck through the Ardennes forest, terrain the French believed impassable. In 10 days they reached the coast. Paris was surrounded by June. Civilians fled south carrying beds, photographs, and bread. The German army didn't chase. It advanced with methodical grace. Every tank, every plane, every division, timed like a symphony of destruction. When the dust settled, France was gone. The world's most glorious city now wore the swastika, June 22nd, 1940. In the same railway carriage where Germany had signed its surrender in 1918, France now signed its own. The symbolism was surgical. Hitler stood silently, smiling only once, a smile that belonged to revenge, not victory. Europe was now his fortress. From the Atlantic to the Carpathians, from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean Sea, a continent was under his boot. But one nation remained free, an island across the Channel. And for Britain, the storm was coming. Blitzkrieg was not just strategy, it was psychology. It relied on speed to break the enemy's mind before it broke his army. To the world, Hitler appeared unbeatable. To his generals, he appeared divine. But divinity breeds delusion, and soon that delusion would meet a sky filled with British hurricanes and Spitfires. Summer, 1940. The sun rose over southern England and caught the silver flash of incoming bombers. Radar screens glowed, sirens wailed, civilians rushed into shelters clutching children and prayer books. The Luftwaffe believed Britain would break in a month. Instead, it met the Royal Air Force. The world held its breath as the Battle of Britain began, a war fought not on land, but in the air, where faith was measured in altitude. July 10th, 1940. Dawn crept over the cliffs of Dover. In the haze above the Channel, faint black dots appeared, then grew wings. Within minutes, the sky howled. It was the first great air battle in history, and Britain stood alone. A shrill siren cut through London's morning calm. People froze, then ran, not to escape, but to witness. Children pointed at silver crosses glittering high above. The Luftwaffe had come. From underground tunnels to cathedral basements, the nation bent but did not break. At airfields across the south, young pilots, some barely 20, scrambled into Hurricanes and Spitfires. Engines roared to life, propellers slicing mist like knives. Up they went, climbing into the fire. They didn't fight for victory, they fought for survival. The odds were mathematical and cruel. The Luftwaffe fielded 2,600 aircraft, the RAF barely 650 fighters. But where Germany had quantity, Britain had radar, discipline, and home. Radar, a new invention, swept invisible lines across the coast. It gave minutes, sometimes seconds, of warning, enough to launch a counterattack before the bombs fell. Each battle was a dance of blips and voices. Bandits heading north, Angels 15. By August, southern England was a chessboard of fire and contrails. Pilots flew 4, 5, 6 sorties a day. Sleep became myth, courage became routine. September 7th, 1940. At 5:30 p.m., the Luftwaffe shifted strategy, no longer targeting airfields. Here, they targeted souls. 800 bombers, escorted by fighters, descended on London. Warehouses along the Thames ignited like torches. St. Paul's Cathedral vanished behind smoke and sparks. The city burned for 57 consecutive nights, a storm of steel and fire called the Blitz. Firefighters battled infernos as church bells melted. Children slept in subway tunnels, entire families huddled between rails. Yet every morning Londoners emerged, brushed ash from their coats and went to work. Each sunrise was an act of defiance. September 15th, 1940. The Luftwaffe launched its largest assault, 1,000 planes, a flying wall of thunder. By evening, 56 German bombers had fallen. The RAF lost 28. The numbers were close, but perception is power. For the first time, Hitler blinked. Operation Salion, the planned invasion of Britain, was postponed, then quietly abandoned. As night fell, Churchill watched the red glow over London and whispered the words that would echo forever. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Britain did not win through might. It endured through will. Its factories kept building. Its people kept believing. And its skies, though filled with death, remained unbroken. For the first time, Hitler's war machine met resistance that did not collapse, a reminder that the blitzkrieg had a limit. Fear, when shared, becomes paralysis, but when defied, it becomes power. Across the Atlantic, another nation watched. President Franklin D. Roosevelt sent words before weapons, sympathy before soldiers. Through the Lend-Lease Act, Britain received ships, planes, and hope, the first breath of transatlantic unity that would one day shape the free world. But on the other side of the planet, another storm gathered. The rising sun of Japan was about to cast a shadow across the Pacific. December 7th, 1941, Hawaii, 07:48 a.m. A quiet Sunday morning. Then the horizon erupted in flame. Pearl Harbor, the day America's illusion of distance vanished. The war was now total, and fascism had reached its zenith. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The morning sun glinted off the Pacific like molten glass. Sailors lined, the decks half asleep, half content. Then, the roar. The sky split open. From it descended 353 Japanese aircraft, gliding in perfect formation. Bombs fell like rain, imprecise, merciless, apocalyptic. Within 2 hours, 8 battleships were shattered, 403 Americans lay dead, and the Pacific Fleet burned. Smoke rose so high it blotted out the sun. Japan had awakened a giant and set the world ablaze. For decades, Japan's generals had dreamed of dominion, an empire that would stretch from Burma to the Hawaiian Islands. They called it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a poetic name for conquest. Now, with one strike, they had forced the United States into the war. The following months were a whirlwind of victories. Hong Kong fell. Singapore surrendered. The Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, all devoured. The rising sun fluttered above half the Pacific, but in its glare a terrible shadow grew. American vengeance, 1942. Across 3 continents, the Axis powers seemed unstoppable. In Europe, German troops marched east. In Africa, Italian divisions advanced under Rommel, the Desert Fox. In Asia, Japan ruled the seas. Propaganda in Berlin proclaimed a new world order. Newspapers showed maps colored in black, red, and white, the colors of empire. Every headline screamed victory. Every radio broadcast promised eternity. But history is cruel to those who mistake expansion for endurance. The fascist world was vast, but it was bleeding from within. June 22nd, 1941. Months before Pearl Harbor, Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. 3 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks, 2,000 planes. A river of men and metal surged into the Soviet Union. The plan was arrogance written in ink, to destroy communism, seize resources, and enslave a continent. At first, it seemed to work. Cities fell in weeks: Minsk, Kiev, Smolensk. Entire Soviet divisions were encircled and annihilated. In autumn, the Wehrmacht stood at the gates of Moscow. Then winter arrived, and the snow became an army. Engines froze, guns jammed. Soldiers died not from bullets, but from the cold. For every kilometer gained, thousands of corpses were left behind, frozen, staring, eternal. The Eastern Front became a graveyard that stretched beyond imagination. Barbarossa was not just war, it was ideology with a bayonet. Hitler called it a crusade against Jewish Bolshevism. Villages were erased, millions of Soviet POWs starved in open fields. Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, followed behind the front lines, executing entire communities. By the end of 1942, over 2 million Jews had already been murdered. Fascism had turned extermination into routine. The war was no longer about territory. It was about purity, about annihilation. The mask had fallen. The monster was visible. In the Pacific, Japan reached its high watermark at Midway, June 1942. 4 aircraft carriers, the Fa, pride of the Japanese Navy, were sunk by US dive bombers in less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes, and the myth of invincibility drowned with them. In the Soviet Union, Hitler's forces surrounded Stalingrad. A city of factories and smoke became a tomb of iron. For 5 months, soldiers fought street to street, room to room, meter by meter. Civilians scavenged the ruins, starving, freezing, refusing to yield. When winter came again, the Red Army struck back. The encirclement tightened. 91,000 German soldiers were captured, the largest surrender in history. Their commander, Field Marshal Paulus, once the architect of conquest, now a prisoner of the very people he had called subhuman. Stalingrad was not just a defeat. It was the breaking of a spell. For the first time, the fascist world bled from wounds it could not heal. By 1943, the tide had turned. In Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps fell at El Alamein. In Italy, Allied troops landed on the shores of Sicily. And Mussolini, once the face of fascism, was overthrown by his own people. The empire of slogans and salutes was crumbling, but as fascism died, it dragged millions down with it. Behind the front lines, trains moved with perfect punctuality, each carriage filled with silence, fear, and names that would never be spoken again. Destinations: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek. The machinery of fascism had evolved into something beyond war, systematic extermination, the final solution, a plan not to defeat enemies, but to erase them. And while the world fought to reclaim land, it failed to see the smoke rising from the forests of Poland. 1944. Europe burns from both ends. From the east, the Red Army surged like a tide of vengeance. From the west, Allied forces gathered beneath grey English skies, preparing to storm the continent. Hitler's empire, once a map of victories, was shrinking by the day, but he refused to see it. Inside the bunker beneath Berlin, the Führer still traced lines of conquest on maps already soaked in defeat. June 6, 1944, Normandy, France. The sea boiled with ships, 7,000 vessels carrying 156,000 men. Waves crashed against steel, sand, and blood. The sky roared with engines, paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines like falling stars. Machine guns cut through the dawn. Bodies floated with the tide. But the Allies held the beaches: Omaha, Utah, Juneau, Sword, Gold. The iron wall of Europe had cracked. By August, Paris rose in rebellion. Within days, German forces retreated. The City of Light, once smothered by swastikas, breathed again. Meanwhile, in the east, the Soviet Union unleashed Operation Bagration, a juggernaut of 2.3 million soldiers. German armies disintegrated beneath the storm. Cities that once fell in weeks, now reclaimed in hours. Villages burned, rebuilt, then burned again, a continent cleansing itself through fire. For the Red Army, this was not just victory, it was vengeance. Every step westward was paid for in memories of the massacres, the starvation, the graves. The ghosts of Stalingrad marched with them. April 1945, Lake Como, Italy. A convoy of black cars wound through the mountains. In the back seat sat Benito Mussolini, pale, trembling, disguised in a German coat. Once hailed as Il Duce, the father of fascism, now a fugitive. He was captured by partisans, beaten and executed. His body hung upside down in Milan's Piazzale Loreto, the crowd cheering not in joy but catharsis. The man who dreamed of empire ended as a warning that tyranny always consumes its own myth. April 30th, 1945. Above the city, artillery thundered like the heartbeat of judgment. Soviet troops closed in street by street, house by house. Beneath the ruins, in a concrete tomb, Adolf Hitler sat surrounded by maps that no longer mattered. His generals argued, His ministers fled. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12. At 3:30 p.m., he took his life. Moments later, his body was burned in the garden of the Chancellery, the same city that once cheered him into power, now reduced to rubble and silence. When the guns fell silent, the world looked around and did not recognize itself. Berlin was a graveyard of stone, Warsaw, a skeleton, Dresden, fire incarnate, Tokyo, ash, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, shadows etched into walls, more than 70 million dead, entire generations erased, ideologies turned to dust. The fascist dream had devoured the world, and in its death revealed the cost of worshipping power. At Nuremberg, justice wore a black robe and spoke in measured words. One by one, the architects of terror faced the world they had tried to dominate. The defense was always the same. I was only following orders. But history does not absolve obedience. The Nuremberg trials gave birth to a new principle, that duty to humanity is greater than duty to a leader. Meanwhile, in Asia, Emperor Hirohito surrendered. His voice, once divine, crackled through radios across Japan. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. For the first time in history, a god apologized. The fascist century ended not with speeches, but with silence. No one cheered. No one won. The victors buried their dead beside their enemies, and the ruins of Europe whispered a truth carved in ash. When men build empires on fear, the walls will always fall inward. November 9th, 1923. Munich, Germany. A man once stood in a beer hall and shouted, "The old world has failed us." 2 decades later, the world answered, not with words but with silence. The silence of millions who had seen what happens when faith becomes fanaticism and pride becomes religion. The fires that once promised greatness had burned the world instead, and from those ashes humanity began again, haunted, humbled, and wiser.